we're going to start drawing what we have in our sketch on the paper. So we're going to start with pencil first, and then any of my objects that I drew overlapping the foreground or the middle ground, I'm actually going to draw them on a separate piece of paper, and I'm going to cut and glue them on today. So if I were copying here what I have in the foreground, I would lightly, keyword lightly, I want to make this easy to erase if we make a mistake. Draw in only the objects that are in the foreground in this bottom section. So down here I have a kind of a plant. Now this would be a fantastic time to add more detail to any of your drawings. When we drew our initial sketches, I kind of told you guys just draw a quick sketch. But anything that you want to add detail to, you're welcome to use your computer to look up reference photos. I'm going to add more objects here, more plants and rocks and things to my foreground. A couple of things to pay attention to is overlapping. If you have an object that's higher up on the page, it should go or look like it goes behind an object that's lower or closer. So if I draw a rock here behind this plant, I need to make sure the rock looks like it's behind the plant. And then another thing to remember is that as objects get higher on the paper, they should get smaller and look further away. Now here in my sketch I have a treasure chest drawn, but on my page it goes over the edge of my foreground. So I'm going to lay the paper, my scrap paper, in its spot to make sure that it will fit. And then I'm going to draw whatever I have here for my treasure chest. And again, this is a great time to go in and add more details to your drawings if they weren't very detailed before. I might add some additional details to this. Make it look like we could add texture. We are not doing on this initial drawing part any shading. So you do not need to color anything in with pencil. We won't add any type of shading until we add color. So these are just line drawings. Now I'm cutting my treasure chest out, and this is very important. When I glue this, the only part that I want to really be attached is the bottom. If I put glue on the top of this and glue it, it's going to glue my sections together. So I'm going to be very conservative with my glue and add the teeniest, tiniest line or maybe a dot or two just to the bottom edge of my object and glue it in its spot. And I'm going to hold it down for 10 or 15 seconds to make sure that it's really on there. I do not want any extra glue because I don't want that piece to get stuck to the piece behind it. Now, you should have a few detailed objects in each section, so make sure this section is complete before you move on. But the best way to draw on your middle ground is to actually flip the foreground over, because we're not necessarily going to stop at this line, although anything you draw that's really detailed should be above that line, so we don't want to hide it. So you can kind of flip it back and forth as you're working, but you might have some objects that kind of peek up behind there. So in my drawing, I've got a continuation of a road. So I'll show you what I mean here as I sketch in my road, which is smaller at the top, wider at the bottom, and I purposefully did not make my road match up because I want it to look like part of the road kind of dips down below this line and I can't see it all. But I don't want to have a road that just stops in the middle of the page. So even though you can't see this unless I flip the foreground back, I'm going to go ahead and finish the road back there. And then I will draw in my little lake or pond here. And in my initial sketch, I didn't really have a lot of detail, but I'm going to add some plants. And of course, if it's lower on the section, I've got to make sure that it's overlapping anything that's higher. So I'm going to check and make sure. I'll add some more little rocks. And these are going to be significantly smaller than the ones I have here in the foreground. And then my castle pops up over my horizon line there for my middle ground. So again, I'm going to be drawing that piece on an extra sheet of paper and then cutting and gluing it. So I'm going to draw that. And I like to hold the extra piece of paper kind of right in the spot. And I've got a little more room here than I drew in my sketch. So I can actually make it a little more detailed. And I know exactly how it's going to fit because I can see the edge of the page there. Now these flags are going to be a little difficult to cut out. That is one thing you want to think about when you're drawing an object that pops up, is that you're drawing something that you personally can cut. I have lots of practice cutting, so I'm confident that I can cut on these tiny little shapes. But if cutting is kind of a challenge for you, you might want to draw something a little easier to cut out. Okay, I might go back and add some more texture to my castle. We're going to eventually go over these pencil lines with Sharpie and then add lots of color. So even though I want it to be neatly drawn and I want to have some detail, I can always go back and add more detail with color. We're going to use pencils, markers, and watercolor on this. So I can always add shading and things like that later. All right, so I've got my castle, the size and shape. Go ahead and cut. I'll give you guys a little tip for cutting tiny little shapes like this. Instead of trying to turn my scissors around in this spot, I can cut from 2 different directions. Sometimes this is easier, sometimes turning the scissors is easier. And try to cut that little section out so I don't tear the paper. And I try to turn my scissors in there. I'm going to do the same thing for my castle top there. I'm going to go back and cut from a different direction. All right, now I have my castle cut out. And again, I'm going to be really careful about how much glue I put on there. And I'm going to hold it in place, make sure none of the glue is touching the other sections. Just hold it down for a little bit. And then I'm ready to move on to my background. Now, I drew extra landforms in my background, so I'm going to flip this back. And let's see, my first hill, I'm going to kind of look at how I've drawn it. It's going to go behind my castle. So I'm going to draw my first hill kind of like this. But again, I don't want to leave the drawing incomplete. So I'm going to go ahead and draw, even though that line will be behind the castle. And then I'm going to draw in my hills here. So I've got 1, 2, 3 overlapping landforms. And then this top section, I kind of imagined would be my sky. And your sky doesn't have to have a straight edge at the top. If you just want to make an interesting shape, you can trim that so you have something a little more fun to look at. And then I'm going to go in and add all my details here. I do have another road. And again, it's getting even smaller than it was here in my middle ground. And I'm not just going to leave it hanging there. I'm going to finish it. At least go to the edge of your paper, if not the bottom. And then I created another little stretch of road back here. And I made it disappear at that point, so I'm not going to continue it after that. That's my vanishing point. And I'm going to add more little plants, teeny tiny little guys, because they do need to be smaller than the plants in my middle ground. And then I did add kind of a little dragon up here. I'm going to sketch that out. And because my dragon will overlap, I'm going to have to erase out anything that it covers. And I'm going to maybe add more detail to this. So this would, anything that you draw like this, that maybe you just drew a little sketch, you might want to look up a picture while you're drawing it on your final piece here so you can get a little more detail. But also, I'm going to remember, this dragon is very far away, so I'm not going to see a ton of detail. And I think I'm going to make his wings bigger, actually. Maybe draw one more foot there. Clean it up, get rid of my extra pencil lines, and now I've got pretty much everything I've drawn in my sketch, although I can go back and add more details anywhere I have some empty space. And each section should look like a complete drawing, even if you do have a lot of empty space at the bottom. There shouldn't be anything that just gets cut off. So flip through and kind of check things as you go, erase anything that overlaps, and just get your drawing cleaned up. This is where we'll stop today. If you do accidentally use too much glue and there's wet glue around this area at the end of art, be sure to put this on the drying rack. When you do put this away today, double check that your name is on the back of your landscape, and you can tuck your sketch into your landscape page to keep them together.